Yesterday, my daughter-in-law handed me a coupon for a tailoring service and said, "You've done enough, Mom. Let the professionals handle it now." She smiled when she said it, but something inside me unraveled. If you've ever stitched your worth into quiet things, into meals, hems, silence, come sit with me. Leave a comment. Maybe we'll share a story over tea. It begins, like most unravelings do, not with a loud tear, but with a soft snap you only notice when everything feels too still. I wake earlier than everyone else, though there's no real need to anymore. The house doesn't require my hands the way it used to. There are no lunch boxes to fill, no shirts to press, no urgent coffee to brew. Still, I rise. A habit of decades doesn't ask for permission to stay. The kettle hums in the stillness. I don't switch on the lights. I prefer the slow spread of morning through the curtains. That bruised indigo before it turns honey-colored. There's comfort in watching the light arrive, inch by inch, on the chipped rim of the kitchen table. That table? I've scrubbed it through every season. Soup spills, sticky juice, glitter from kindergarten crafts. I've watched elbows lean in over whispered arguments, laughter, apologies, secrets. But lately, the table's quieter. It hosts more phones than voices now. And my seat, the one closest to the stove, is usually left empty, unless someone wants an extra napkin. I don't remember the last time someone asked how I slept. It's not cruelty, not really. It's drift. A slow tide of new routines, new roles. My son is busy, always something urgent at work. My daughter-in-law is efficient, and I admire that. She runs the house like a ship, charts, goals, appointments, and I am the quiet weight at the bottom, steady but unnecessary. Yesterday, I noticed the laundry basket had been moved. A small thing, but it stung. For years, I'd been the one to wash, to fold, to smooth sleeves and mend linings. My hands knew the stories of every garment. I could tell who had a fever by the weight of the sheets, but now she uses a service. Drop off, pick up, folded in plastic. She said it saves time. I nodded, of course. I always nod. There is a type of kindness that feels like pushing you out with a smile, a thank you that sounds like goodbye. So I keep my rituals. I sweep the kitchen, even when it's clean. I wipe the counters with a lavender cloth. I open the window above the sink and listen for the birds. Sometimes they come, sometimes they don't, but I always listen. It's strange how a house can be full and still feel hollow in the middle. I hear their footsteps upstairs, laughter, the clatter of a cereal bowl. I stay downstairs. Not unwelcome, just not needed. This morning, I sat with my tea and watched a thread dangle from my sleeve. I reached for my old sewing tin, tucked in the drawer beneath the toaster behind the extra batteries. It's rusted now, the hinge stiff. But inside, the same neat rows of spools, a cushion of needles, a few buttons from coats long gone. I held the tin in my lap a long while. Then I heard footsteps coming down the stairs, and I closed it. Some things belong to silence now. And I am learning how to live there. When I was younger, much younger, my fingers never stopped moving. They threaded through days like needles, always stitching, patching, keeping things from falling apart. It wasn't just clothes. It was birthdays, grocery lists, hurt feelings, lost buttons, forgotten appointments. I was the seam that held us. We didn't have much, not in those early years. My husband, Richard, worked long shifts at the rail yard, and I learned to stretch $1 like dough. We bought secondhand everything, cribs, coats, curtains. I taught myself how to sew because buying new just wasn't an option. It started with hemming his trousers, patching knees, adjusting collars. Before long, it became second nature. I could feel the difference between polyester and wool with my eyes closed. And oh, the joy of it when it worked. When I could take something torn and make it whole again. My son Michael once called me a magician. He was 5, I think, tugging at my skirt with one sock unraveled. Fix it, Mama, make it better. I did. Every time. I kept every scrap of fabric that passed through my hands. Little folded corners from old Halloween costumes, leftover lace from my wedding gown. I trimmed the neckline myself. Even the blue gingham from Michael's baby blanket. It's strange what you remember. I can't recall what I ate for lunch 2 days ago, but I can close my eyes and see that blanket, frayed at the edges, soft from being loved too hard. Richard never quite understood the joy I got from sewing. You spend more time with that box of threads than you do resting, he used to say. He wasn't wrong, but he didn't say it unkindly. He'd kiss the top of my head as he passed by. Don't forget you're a person too, Evelyn. I laughed. The first time he said that. Someone has to keep the seams from splitting, I told him. We weren't romantic, not in the way stories tell you to be, but we were real, dependable. He built shelves without being asked. I made casseroles without being thanked. And sometimes at night, he would hold my hand in bed, rough calluses brushing against my fingers. And we wouldn't say anything at all, just breathe, in rhythm. When he died, I stopped breathing properly. Not literally, of course. But the rhythm changed. The silence in the house became thicker, and my hands didn't know where to go anymore. There were no shirts to iron, no socks to fold, no boots to wipe. Just empty time. Michael had already married by then. They invited me to move in, and I said yes. I didn't know how to be alone. I still don't, not really. The first few years here were good. My grandson, Henry, was still little. He called me Mimi, and I would sew him soft animals from leftover fabric. His favorite was a penguin I made from an old scarf of Richard's. I embroidered the tiniest heart on its belly. He used to sleep with it under his arm. I'd find it in the laundry sometimes, its beak all chewed up. I thought I still had a place, that my presence was useful, that my hands were still needed. But time is a quiet thief. It doesn't break the door down. It just slowly, gently, starts taking things. And you don't even realize what's gone until you reach for it. Last week, I was folding Henry's hoodie when I noticed the seam had started to split under the arm. I smiled. My fingers still knew what to do. I reached for the old tin, ready to sit down by the window and patch it, when Sarah, my daughter-in-law, stepped in. "Oh, don't worry about that," she said, taking the hoodie from my hands. "I've got a punch card for Stitch Right downtown. They do repairs." I must have paused too long because she added, "You've done this for so long, Mom. You should rest." She meant it kindly, but I just nodded. I always nod. And now that tin sits a little heavier in my drawer. I try not to feel small, but I do. I feel like a decorative plate left on a high shelf. Nice to have, not meant to be used. Sometimes I wonder if they know who I used to be, that I kept this family stitched together for decades, sometimes literally, that I once pulled together Christmas morning with nothing but 7 tulle, scraps of fabric, and a cinnamon stick, that my hands are not just tired. They are full of stories, but I don't say any of that. Instead, I put the tin back in the drawer and I whisper to myself, "You are still here. Even if they don't look, even if they never ask, you are still here." It was Tuesday, the quietest day of the week, no errands, no visitors, the kind of day that used to stretch long and golden when Michael was small. I'd bake bread, let it cool by the window, and he'd come tumbling in with scraped knees and grass in his hair. I used to live for Tuesdays. Now they're just blank. I'd just finished my tea, the one I steep in the same mug every morning, a pale yellow one with a crack on the handle. Yeah, from years ago. Richard had dropped it once while handing it to me, and I told him, "That's good luck, you know, a cup that's been through something." The crack never grew. It just stayed, like a quiet reminder that even broken things can hold warmth. I was rinsing that cup when I saw the slip of paper, a square coupon torn from one of those bright circulars, neatly placed on the corner of the table where I usually sit. It read, 25% off Stitch Right tailoring, because every stitch matters. Underneath, in Sarah's handwriting, thought of you. I stared at it longer than I meant to. I know she meant it as a kindness. I know. But that morning, it landed like a stone in my chest. Thought of me? When choosing someone else to sew the clothes I've patched for 30 years? When Michael was in 3rd grade, his backpack tore the week before picture day. We couldn't afford another, so I stayed up that night sewing the straps back on with denim thread and hope. I embroidered his initials in the corner, just so it'd feel a little new. When Sarah's dress tore before a cousin's wedding, I added a lace insert to make it fit. She said it was better than when she bought it. When Henry lost the ears on his penguin plush, I sewed them back, twice. The second time, I reinforced them with interfacing. He didn't notice, but I did. Every stitch mattered. So when I saw that coupon, something inside me went very still. I didn't cry. I haven't. Not for a long time. Not because I don't want to, but because I've learned how to absorb things. Like a sponge cloth you never quite wring out. Sadness seeps in, and you just keep going. I folded the coupon and tucked it in the sewing tin next to the green spool I only use for Henry's pajamas. I didn't say anything to Sarah. There's no point. The world doesn't mean harm when it forgets you. It just moves on. Later that afternoon, I swept the kitchen floor. The sound of bristles against tile has always soothed me. It's steady, predictable. I like when the small messes go away with effort. That's something no one notices anymore. How often I tidy up after them, quietly, without fuss. Crumbs from toast, damp footprints, a cereal box left out overnight. I wonder if they think the house stays clean on its own. As I swept under the dining table, I found a button, a navy one, smooth and round, probably from one of Michael's work shirts. I held it in my hand, and my fingers tingled with memory. I used to keep buttons like that in a jar by the window. Different sizes, shapes, some from coats I no longer owned. Henry once asked me if the buttons were sleeping. I told him yes, waiting to be needed again. This one hadn't waited long. It belonged to a shirt I'd ironed just last week. I placed it gently on the edge of the table, and for a moment, just a moment, I wondered if anyone would ask me to sew it back. They didn't. That evening, over dinner, Sarah mentioned a new dry cleaning place that also offers mending services. "It's all contactless," she said, passing the salad. "You just drop off and pick up with a code. Super easy." Michael nodded, already half scrolling through his phone. Convenient. I watched them both, not angry, just detached. Like watching a rerun of a show you used to love. Familiar, but no longer yours. They weren't being unkind. They weren't doing anything wrong. That's what makes it harder. When pain doesn't come from cruelty, but from indifference. From not being seen. Later that night, when the house had gone still and the dishwasher hummed its sleepy rhythm, I opened the sewing tin one more time. The coupon was still there, folded neatly, pretending to be thoughtful. I moved it aside and found the navy button again, and without thinking, I threaded a needle. The thread slid through like muscle memory. I stitched the button onto a spare piece of cloth, just so it wouldn't roll away, just so I wouldn't forget what it felt like. The thread pulled tight with that quiet snap I know so well, a sound like belonging. Then I blew out the candle and went to bed, whispering to the night, "You don't need to be seen to still hold things together, but still. It would be nice, once in a while." I didn't open the sewing tin the next day, not because I was angry. I don't believe in anger, not the sharp kind that cuts and echoes. It never sat well in my body. I was raised to be polite, composed, useful. Anger felt like something loud people had permission to feel. I learned early how to press my lips together and smile, to exhale pain instead of speaking it. But that morning, something had shifted. I still rose early, still watched the sky change its color through the same dusty lace curtain. I brewed my tea, the same as always, pale, with a single sugar cube, familiar, safe. But I didn't reach for the tin. I didn't touch the drawer. I didn't mend anything. Instead, I sat in silence, a long, breathing silence that filled the room like fog. Henry came down the stairs half awake, dragging his feet, hair tousled like a little dandelion gone to seed. He glanced at me and muttered, "Morning, Mimi," before reaching for the cereal box without waiting for help. He's learned to do everything quickly, quietly, without asking. I nodded. "Morning, love." He didn't look up. Sarah followed a few minutes later, her heels clicking briskly. She wore one of the dresses I'd altered for her last year. I recognized the hem, how I'd taken it up just slightly to flatter her height. She passed behind me, humming, smelling of lemon shampoo and purpose. "You okay, Mom?" she asked, not slowing. "I'm fine," I said. The words sat flat. "Oh, good. We'll be out most of the day. Henry's got soccer practice, and I have that board meeting. I ordered groceries online, so no need to go out." She kissed Henry's head, grabbed her tote, and left in a flurry of car keys in motion. Michael came down last, as always. He looked tired. He always looks tired now. The weight of years sits differently on men. It turns them gray and distant, like foggy buildings behind glass. He saw me sitting still and paused. "You're not mending today?" he asked, gesturing vaguely toward the drawer. "No," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Everything okay?" I smiled, polite and practiced. "Just resting my hands." He nodded, already drifting. "That's good. You deserve that." And with that, he was gone too. I was left with the sound of a ticking clock and a cold cup of tea. No one asked why I looked so quiet. No one wondered what I hadn't said. The truth is, something had broken. Not like a plate or a cup. Those you can sweep up, glue back together. No, this was softer, deeper, like a loose thread finally pulled too far. When Richard died, I lost half of myself, but the other half, the part that gave, that stayed useful, carried me through. I told myself I still mattered, that if I stayed kind, stayed busy, stayed available, they would always see me. That usefulness could be love in disguise. But that morning, I saw it clearly. They didn't need me. They didn't see me. They were simply used to me. That's a different kind of ache. I walked to the window. The street outside was empty except for a stray grocery bag tumbling in the wind. I watched it flutter like something trying to be free but forgetting how. It caught on a fence post and sagged. In the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection. Tired eyes, hair too neatly pinned, the soft lines near my mouth etched from decades of saying, "I'm fine." I reached up and loosened my bun. My hair fell around my shoulders, gray and stubborn, and I didn't pin it back. For the rest of the day, I didn't clean. I didn't sew. I didn't fold anything that wasn't mine. Instead, I pulled down the old photo albums from the hallway shelf. I hadn't looked at them in years, not since before I moved in here. Dust bloomed when I opened the covers, but the pictures inside were untouched, smiling snapshots of the life I built. Birthdays, camping trips, that one disastrous beach day when the tide soaked our lunch, Michael missing a front tooth, Richard in his favorite flannel shirt, holding a fishing pole like it was a sword, and there I was, always in the background, holding things, carrying bags, wiping mouths, taking photos instead of being in them. It struck me, gently but firmly, I had made a life where everyone else could thrive, but somewhere along the way, I'd misplaced myself. That evening, I took a walk, alone, without telling anyone. Just the soft crunch of gravel and the smell of lilacs brushing against the sidewalk. The breeze tugged at my sweater like a familiar hand. When I returned, no one had noticed I'd gone. And that, I think, hurt the most. I stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then I turned off the light and went upstairs without touching a single thing. There's a particular silence that settles into the corners of a life. Not the peaceful kind, like falling snow or pages turning in a library. No, the silence is the kind that hums beneath your ribs, a soft reminder that you've become background noise in a place you helped build. It's the silence that greets you when no one asks where you've been, when your footsteps no longer draw eyes, When your absence folds neatly into the day like it was always meant to be there. That silence had followed me for weeks now. One afternoon when the house was empty again, I decided to sort through the linen cupboard, not because it needed sorting, it didn't, or it didn't him, but because my hands needed something to do, and folding had always felt like prayer to me. The smell of old lavender sachets, the smooth cotton under my palms, it anchored me. Halfway down the shelf, I found a small muslin bundle tied with twine. I paused. I didn't remember placing it there. I untied the knot and opened the cloth, and inside were scraps of fabric, mismatched, faded. My heart caught. These were remnants from clothes I'd made or mended over the years. A corner from Michael's baby quilt, a strip from the hem of Richard's church shirt, even a tiny floral print I'd once sewn into a doll dress for a neighbor's daughter. I had forgotten I'd saved them. I sat down right there on the floor, cross-legged like a child, and spread them out like a patchwork of memory. My fingers found a square of corduroy, brown, soft, familiar, and then I remembered. It was from the jacket Richard wore the winter Henry was born. He had carried it over his arm when he paced the hospital hallway, nervous and trying to look calm. I had sewn a new pocket onto that jacket the night before. He'd ripped the old one catching his keys. I hadn't thought about that pocket in years. I brought the fabric square to my nose. It no longer smelled of him, just time and dust. But in my mind, I heard his voice clear as a bell. "You always save things," he used to tease. "You'll outlive all of us, Evelyn, even the threads." Maybe I will. But what happens when all the threads you've kept begin to slip through your hands? Lately, I feel like I'm watching my life from behind a window. I see Michael laughing at something Henry says at dinner. I see Sarah balancing her work, her plans, her order. They are good people. But the space between us has widened, not with words. There are still pleasantries, small favors, polite smiles, but with absence. An absence of knowing, of remembering who I was before I became just helpful. I think what no one tells you about aging is that you start to disappear while you're still here. That week I tried to sew again, not out of obligation. No pants to hem, no toys to fix, just for me. I pulled out my sewing tin and chose the faded green spool, the one I always save for mending Henry's sleepwear. My hands trembled more than they used to. The thread took longer to slip through the needle, but I did it. I chose one of the fabric scraps, the gingham from Michael's baby quilt, and began stitching a slow, even line across a plain muslin square. No purpose, just motion, just memory. And then, halfway through, I pricked my finger. It wasn't deep, but the sight of blood, bright against the pale cloth, stopped me. I watched as it spread into the fabric, a small bloom of red. I sat back, needle resting in my lap, and I felt something heavy settle in my chest. All these years, I'd held everyone else together, and somewhere along the line, I'd let go of myself. I'd forgotten what I needed, what I loved, who I was when no one needed me. I stared at that little blood stain and thought, maybe it's time to stitch something new, not for them, for me, not to be useful, but to be whole. That night, I didn't set the table. I let them do it. I didn't fold their laundry. I folded my muslin cloth, gently, with care. No one noticed, and that was the last piece I needed to understand. Sometimes the world won't clap for your quiet grief, your quiet strength, your quiet letting go. But that doesn't make it any less real. That night, I dreamt of a garden I haven't seen in years. My old rose bush, the one Richard planted for me behind the shed. In the dream, it bloomed again, not with flowers, but with scraps of fabric, each one fluttering like a flag in the wind. Each one a piece of me I had once given away. That night, I dreamt of a garden I haven't seen in years, my old rose bush, the one Richard planted for me behind the shed. In the dream, it bloomed again. Not with flowers, but with scraps of fabric, each one fluttering like a flag in the wind. Each one a piece of me I had once given away. When I woke up, the light in the room was soft and gray. It had rained sometime in the night. I could smell it through the open crack of the window. that deep, damp scent of earth trying to speak. I sat up slowly, my joints murmuring their usual complaints. My fingers brushed the bedside table, where I'd left the muslin square with the gingham scrap and the tiny bloodstain. I traced the edge of the cloth. It felt like holding a part of my younger self, someone I hadn't spoken to in a very long time. I realized I didn't know the last time someone had asked me what I loved, not what I was good at, not what I could help with, but what made me feel like me. It's a question that stays unanswered for too long in women like me. We become roles. Mother, wife, grandmother, mother-in-law. We become functions. And the moment we slow down or step back, it feels like the world forgets we were ever anything else. I stared at the ceiling for a long time that morning. Then I rose, dressed, and made a decision. I wouldn't leave. Not yet. But I would begin. Quietly, intentionally. I would carve out space inside this life, for my life. I would gather what was left of me, whatever threads I still had, and begin stitching myself back together. I started by clearing out the hall closet, the one no one ever opened. Behind winter coats and forgotten umbrellas, I found a box labeled in my handwriting. Keepsakes. Inside, a letter from Richard, folded into a yellowed envelope with my maiden name. Michael's old baby shoe, cracked but intact. A single glove I never found the match for, soft with wear. And at the very bottom, a tiny velvet pouch. I had forgotten all about it. I opened the pouch and found a thimble. Silver. Dented slightly on one side. Richard had given it to me the first Christmas after Michael was born. "You need armor," he'd said, grinning as he held it up. "You patch us all together. Least I can do is keep your fingers safe." I held it in my palm now like a holy thing. And I wept. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. As though something inside me had finally softened enough to melt. When the tears stopped, I wiped my cheeks and whispered, "Thank you." To him. To myself. To the version of me that had saved that thimble all these years. That afternoon, I set up a small sewing corner in my bedroom. Not in the hallway, not in the kitchen, just for me. I unfolded an old wooden chair and laid out my fabric scraps. I pinned the muslin square to a small corkboard right beside the window. I stitched a single line of green thread beneath the blood stain, not to hide it, but to hold it in place. Because that's what I've done my whole life, isn't it? Held things in place. But now I'm learning to hold me. I didn't tell anyone about the corner. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't announce it. Some things don't need permission to exist. That night, I didn't wait up to do the dishes. I didn't fold their coats or lay out Henry's school bag. I sat in my room next to my little square of stitched cloth and breathed. I thought of all the things I'd forgotten to say for myself, the books I never read, the places I never went, the conversations I avoided because peace was easier than presence. But I have this now, this room, this thread, this small beginning. Maybe it's not too late to return to myself. Maybe I'm not gone, just tucked away, waiting, like a thimble in a velvet pouch, like a thread in a quiet drawer. Still here, still strong. I didn't plan it, not in the way people expect when they hear someone say they left. There were no packed suitcases, no tearful goodbyes or slammed doors, no final speech about not being appreciated. I simply woke up one morning, looked out at the pale light hitting the carpet, and realized this wasn't my home anymore. It still had my quilts on the beds, my dishes in the cupboards, my soft fingerprints on the doorknobs. But it no longer had me. Michael and Sarah were kind, in their own busy way. They didn't mean to push me out. They just never noticed I'd been receding. And perhaps that's the point. When you become invisible, your leaving doesn't cause a ripple. That morning, I made myself tea and drank it in silence. I didn't touch the laundry. I didn't wipe the countertops. I sat by the window and listened to the creak of the floorboards overhead as Henry got ready for school. No one came down to join me. The house was already full of motion, and I was just part of the background hum. I placed a note on the kitchen table. Not long, not dramatic. Just a few lines in tidy cursive. I've gone to stay with Margaret for a while. Don't worry. I'm well. Please don't call unless it's urgent. Love, Mom. Margaret was my cousin. We used to write each other once a month before everything became texts and voicemails. She lived 3 hours away in a small town where the grocery store still closed on Sundays, and the librarian knew everyone's name. We hadn't spoken in over a year, but when I called her, she didn't hesitate. Of course, Evelyn, she said, her voice warm and sturdy. Come, you'll have the guest room, and we can sit on the porch and be old and full of stories. I arrived that afternoon with only a canvas bag. Inside, my sewing tin, the fabric scrap I'd been stitching, 2 cardigans, and the silver thimble. It felt like enough. Margaret's home smelled like lemon and thyme. Everything had softened there. The curtains, the walls, even the clock seemed to tick slower. She didn't ask me for explanations. She handed me a cup of tea and said, "When you're ready." We didn't speak about the past that night. We watched the sky change over the hills and listened to the crickets. I breathed in for what felt like the first time in years. In the days that followed, something inside me began to settle. I walked in the mornings, past rose bushes and mailboxes with peeling paint. People nodded as they passed. Some smiled. One woman, seeing my gray hair and cardigan, simply said, "Good morning, hun," like I'd lived there forever. I started sewing again, but only what I wanted to. I found an old linen skirt at a thrift shop and embroidered along the hem, tiny vines curling upward like they were climbing back to life. Margaret called it healing by thread. We laughed. We made soup. We were quiet. I still miss them. Michael, Henry, even Sarah. But it was a softer missing now, not the kind that bruised, just the ache of something once held tightly, now let go. One afternoon, I sat on the porch with my sewing tin open beside me. The light was just right, golden and kind. I pulled out the muslin square with the gingham scrap and traced the stitches I'd done weeks ago. The blood stain had faded, but I left it untouched. I added a new line of thread, pale blue this time. Steady, clean. And I whispered aloud, "This part is mine." No one was around to hear it, but I did. I finally did. That night, Margaret found me in the living room folding napkins I'd just finished hemming. She placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You're glowing, you know." I smiled. Maybe I just stopped dimming myself. She nodded, her eyes glassy. Don't ever fold yourself to fit someone else's drawer again. I think, for many women, leaving doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like choosing your own name again, like walking slowly toward a version of yourself you left in a drawer, wrapped in muslin and memory. I don't know how long I'll stay here. But for now, the birds know when I sit on the porch. The kettle whistles for me. The cloth under my needle isn't a chore. It's a poem. And my silence, it no longer feels like absence. It feels like peace. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I first stitched my name again. Not a full name, not Mom, not Mimi, not Mrs. Evelyn Price, just Evelyn. 5 letters, small and curved, looped gently onto a piece of linen I had washed and pressed the night before. I stitched it slowly, deliberately. The E came out slightly tilted. The Y dipped a little too low, but it was mine. Afterward, I stared at it for a long while. That name hadn't been just mine in decades. I used to sign school forms with it, fill prescriptions, etch it inside the covers of recipe books. Then, over time, it began to vanish behind other titles, helpful ones, loving ones, but never quite mine. My name had become a service, an identity worn thin from constant wear. But here, in Margaret's sunlit sitting room, my name belonged to me again, stitched in soft blue thread, steady as breath. Margaret noticed, of course. She notices everything, but never makes it heavy. "I like the curve on the L," she said, passing behind me with a tray of toast and jam. "Looks like it's dancing a little." I smiled. Maybe I am too. That week, I started sewing little patches, each with a word or a symbol that had once meant something to me, and maybe still did. One was a daisy, like the ones Richard used to pick on our walks. One was a small cup for all the quiet teas that held me together. One square simply said, "Enough," and another said, "Still here." I didn't know what I was making yet, and I wasn't sewing for a purpose. That was the freedom of it. I didn't need to be useful. I was simply creating space for myself, one thread at a time, and Margaret began calling it the cloth of you. One evening, she said, "Weens, Evie, you've spent so long weaving other people's warmth, you forgot you could make your own blanket." That image stayed with me. So I began connecting the patches, slowly, carefully. I backed them with soft flannel and hand-stitched each seam. I didn't rush. It wasn't about finishing, it was about listening to the rhythm of the needle, the hum of my thoughts, the memory carried in every square. Some afternoons, I'd sew by the window and think of Henry. I missed him the most. I wondered if he noticed I was gone, if he still slept with that penguin, if he remembered how I used to hum while sewing near his room, never loud, just enough to let him know I was there. I didn't reach out. I wasn't ready. Letting go, I've learned, doesn't mean slamming doors. Sometimes it's just not rushing to open them again. One night, as I pieced together the corner of the cloth, I came across a scrap I didn't recognize at first. A gray cotton with faint pinstripes. It smelled faintly of cedar and soap. I held it to the light. It was from Richard's work shirt, the one he wore on our last anniversary. I must have saved it without thinking, tucked it among the others, too painful to name. My hands shook as I sewed it in. I didn't try to center it or make it perfect. I simply added it to the rest, like memory should be. Raw and unsorted, but there. When I finished for the night, I stepped outside with a shawl around my shoulders and the stars blinking like gentle reminders. I whispered, "I'm not lost." It felt true for the first time in years. The next morning, Margaret brought the mail in. She handed me a small envelope, plain and unmarked except for my name. Inside was a short letter. It was from Henry. His handwriting was messy and slanted, the way boys write when they don't want anyone watching. The letter said, "Dear Mimi, I found your sewing tin. Dad said you went to visit someone, but I miss you. I wore the penguin shirt last week and it still smells like you. Did you make it smell like that on purpose? Love, Henry." I read it 3 times. Then I folded it and placed it inside the tin. Not because I needed to keep it safe, but because it had finally come full circle. A stitch I hadn't known was loose, gently pulled back into place. Later that day, I added one final patch to my cloth. Just one word, return. Not a promise, not a plan, but a reminder that I could, one day, walk back in. Whole, named, not needed, but wanted. I spent the morning pressing the last patch into place. The cloth, or quilt, I suppose, was uneven. It waved slightly at the edges, dipped where my hands had trembled, puckered where the fabric resisted. But when I spread it across the end of the bed, it felt, right. Like a life lived fully. Imperfect. Soft. Honest. I ran my palm over the patch that said Evelyn, and I smiled. It was no longer strange to see my name like that. Uncloaked, unsuffixed. Mine. Margaret came in, holding a letter. "Post for you," she said gently, placing it beside the tin on my dresser. It was from Michael. I stared at the envelope for a long while before opening it. His handwriting looked stiffer than I remembered. Precise. Like he'd practiced the words before letting them land. Inside was a single sheet, folded once. "Mom, we found your note the day you left." I read it aloud, and the kitchen went quiet. At first, I thought you were upset with us. Then I thought maybe you were just tired. But now I think maybe you needed space, the kind we hadn't offered. Henry asks about you every day. Sarah, too, in her way. I walked past your sewing tin the other night. The lid was closed, but I sat there for a while anyway. I remembered how you used to sit near my door when I had nightmares, quietly stitching just to let me know you were close. I want you to know I hear the quiet now, And I'm sorry. Come back when you're ready. Come back as you. Love, Michael. I didn't cry. Not immediately. I held the letter in both hands, rereading the line, "Come back as you." It was the first time in years someone had acknowledged that I still was someone. Not a role, not a helper, just me. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't quite understood until then. I had forgiven them. Not because they asked, not because they had changed everything, but because holding on to the ache meant I had to keep living in it. And I was ready, finally, to put it down. That afternoon, I sat with Margaret in the garden. The quilt was folded across my lap, warm from the sun. I told her, "I think I'm going to send it to them." She looked at me, surprised. "The quilt?" I nodded. "Yes. All of it, every patch, every word. Won't you miss it?" "I've stitched every piece into myself already," I said, and I meant it. "They need to see what I've carried." I added a note, folded into one of the seams, just beneath the patch that read, "Return." The note said, "This is not a goodbye. This is a map. Each square is a story I never told. Each stitch, something I gave quietly. I have always been here, even when you didn't see me. Now you will." Mom. I wrapped the quilt in brown paper and tied it with a ribbon of leftover lace. Margaret and I walked to the post office together. No fanfare, just steady footsteps on old sidewalk. The clerk weighed it, stamped it, and smiled. "Looks like it holds a lot." I nodded. "It does." We walked home without speaking. There was nothing to say that wasn't already understood. That night, I slept with the window open. The wind came in gently, like breath. I dreamt again, not of rose bushes or old shirts, but of myself, walking barefoot on a soft floor, holding nothing but my name. In the dream, someone opened a door. Not for help, not for chores, not for mending, just for me. When I woke, the birds were already singing. I sat up, stretched, and poured myself a cup of tea. And as the steam rose into the morning light, I whispered, "I'm ready now." The end. But her thread continues quietly, somewhere within you.